The Israel-Palestinian conflict is one of the most controversial unsolved issues in our contemporary world. Tensions between the two entities cyclically resurfaces since 1948, when Israel declared its independence. Nobody knows for sure how and when it will end, because it has been going on since the last century. And for this reason, it deserves to be well analyzed. The first step of the dispute dates back to the Great War. With the Ottoman Empire's fall, the United Kingdom and France wanted to put the territory of Palestine under their control. In 1916, the United Kingdom, France, Russia and Italy concluded the secret Sykes-Picot Agreement. With this act, the countries wanted to allocate the territories which came out from the fragmentation of the Ottoman Empire under European powers' sphere of influence. At the same time, the powers acknowledged the sovereignty of the territory to locals and they specified the recognition of an Arab independent state or a confederation of Arab states in the agreement, pandering to Palestinians' demands.
The Arabs didn't know about the division of their land until a year and a half later, when Russian newspapers published a copy of the agreement. The British had promised them something entirely different: self-determination and control of territories in return for revolting against their Ottoman overlords.
At the end of the First World War, Palestine was subjected to the control of British mandate. It was a direct consequence of the decisions taken by the League of Nations. Despite covenant provision claimed, the wishes of these communities must be a principal consideration in the selection of the mandatory. The will of Palestinian people was constantly ignored. In the meantime, in 1917 British government represented by the British Foreign Secretary, Sir Arthur James Balfour, made commitments to the Zionist organization with the following words: "Dear Lord Rothschild, I have much pleasure in conveying to you on behalf of His Majesty's government the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the Cabinet. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. I should be grateful if you would bring this declaration to the knowledge of the Zionist Federation. Yours sincerely, Arthur James Balfour." The statement was also known as Balfour Declaration. From that moment, the process called Aliyah, which means return to Israel, started. From 1919 to 1929 around 122,000 Jews settled down in Palestine, helped by the British Mandate which created the conditions for this immigration wave. Furthermore, another 250,000 Jew immigrants landed from Europe and territory in the period between 1929 and 1939. These immigrational waves created many concerns and fears among Palestinian Arabs, fueling tensions between the parts. In 1929, some riots were organized by Arabs, killing some Jews and initiating a temporary depopulation of them in Hebron. Other clashes were made during the Great Uprisings, which happened during the period from 1936 to 1939. In order to calm the tensions down, British decided to introduce white papers in 1939. This act limited Jew immigration in Palestine. And despite the Aliyah continued, this set the stage for a peaceful coexistence between the two parties in the following 8 years. At the end of the Second World War, new issues arose between Arabs and Jews. In order to solve the question definitely, the newborn United Nations started the negotiations for a partition for the creation of two entities, an Israel state and a Palestinian one. But even if the agreement was accepted by Jews, Palestinians refused it.
You all know how to vote. Those who are in favor will say yes, those who are against will say no. And the abstainers always they know what to say. We will start it now.
Afghanistan, no. Argentina, abstention. Australia, yes. Belgium, yes. Bolivia, yes. Brazil, yes. Belarus, yes. Egypt, no. El Salvador, abstention. Ethiopia? Abstain? France? Yes. Greece? No. Guatemala? Yes. Haiti? Yes. Honduras? Abstain? Iran? No. Iraq? No. Lebanon? No. Soviet Union? Yes. United Kingdom? Abstain. The United States? Yes.
The approval made by the UN members of the Resolution 181/1947, which revealed the terms of the division, led to a growth of the tensions and culminated in Arab-Israeli conflict in 1948, after the Israeli Declaration of Independence. Arab coalition was made by Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, and Transjordan, now Jordan, and supported Palestinian Arabs. Meanwhile, the Arab-Israeli conflict broke out. Israel started its aggressive policies of expansion. It expelled more than 750,000 Palestinians from their homes between 1947 and 1949. Moreover, Israelis occupied more territories than had been given to Israel by the resolution. At this moment, the phenomenon known as al-Nakba, which means the catastrophe, in Arabic started. Many Palestinians who left the country couldn't and can't exercise their right to return. And although the first Arab-Israeli conflict ended in 1949, the tensions continued. In 1967, a war broke out between Israel on the one side and Egypt, Jordan and Syria on the other side. During this so-called Six-Day War, Israel seized control of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, the Gaza Strip, the Golan Heights and the Sinai Peninsula. The war resulted in hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees and brought more than 1 million Palestinians under Israeli rule. This resulted in growing Palestinian resistance, which came to an outburst in 1987. This marked the first Intifada, the Palestinian uprising against Israeli occupation. Israel was criticized for disproportionate use of violence. Eventually, this unrest was to last for almost 6 years. It was only in 1993 that there seemed to be a genuine possibility for peaceful coexistence between the Palestinians and the Israelis with the signing of the Oslo Accords. It was the moment of recognition between Israel and the PLO. Furthermore, it resulted into the partition of the Palestinian territories in A, B and C areas. The A area is designated for the Palestinians, the B is under Israeli military control and the C is open for Israeli settlements. The Oslo Accords were the beginning of a peaceful coexistence, yet were never fully lived up to. This led to another uprising in the year 2000, the Second Intifada. In 2005, Palestinian President Abbas and Israeli President Sharon agreed to end the mutual violence.
Decades since Ariel Sharon entered the Al-Aqsa compound. The side of a right-wing Israeli politician in the third holy site of Islam sparked a major Palestinian uprising. And when it ended 5 years later, around 1,000 Israelis had been killed, while Palestinians were left with more than 3,000 dead, and a separation wall.
In 2006, there were Palestinian elections in which Palestinians living in East Jerusalem, the Gaza Strip and the West Bank could vote. Hamas won an absolute minority. Hamas was founded during the First Intifada and is mainly focused on freeing the Palestinians from Israeli occupation and creating an independent Palestinian state. In the years thereafter, tensions remained and sometimes flared up into new conflicts. Hamas is in control over the Gaza Strip and Fatah, under President Abbas, controls the West Bank. Hamas is internationally viewed as a terrorist organization, which hinders direct negotiations with the organization. In the month of Ramadan 2021, tensions escalated into a new war between Hamas and Israel. It all started with a looming eviction of 6 Palestinian families living in East Jerusalem, the Sheikh Jarrah district. This sparked clashes between the Palestinians and the Israeli security forces in the neighborhood, which soon led to violence between Palestinians and Israelis throughout the rest of the city. Then, in an accumulation of tensions, fighting erupted between the Israeli police and Palestinian worshippers at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, a sacred place for both Jews and Muslims. It left hundreds of Palestinians and 20 Israelis wounded. Hamas brought forward an ultimatum for the Israeli police to withdraw. As the deadline passed, Hamas fired rockets at Jerusalem for the first time in years. In response, Israel started airstrikes on Gaza. This exchange of rocket fire continued for 11 days. According to the Israeli side, it was only bombing Hamas compounds and war-targeted areas beforehand. President Biden of the U.S. made a statement to support Israel in its war against Hamas, in which he said that Israel has the right to defend itself.
My national security staff and defense staff has been in constant contact with their counterparts in the Middle East, not just with the Israelis, but also with everyone from the Egyptians to the Saudis to the Emiratis, etc. And I had a conversation with Bibi Netanyahu not too long ago. I'll be putting out a statement very shortly on that. My expectation and hope is that this will be closing down sooner than later. But Israel has a right to defend itself when you have thousands of rockets flying into your territory.
Thus, Israel proclaims that it acts in line with international law, which is supported by the United States. However, within Israel, there are also different views towards the conflict. Israelis protest against the Israeli bombings and advocate for a peaceful solution of the conflict, as can be seen in the following video.
We came here to protest against violence, to say after this war that war didn't solve anything. The only way to have peace and justice between Israel and Palestine is two-state solution, peace agreement without violence, two states living together in partnership and peace.
Another issue for the Jewish community that comes along with the escalation is the rise of anti-Semitism across the world. For instance, in the U.S., Jews were attacked on the streets and synagogues leveled their security measures up. One example of how the Israelis experience the escalation can be seen in the following fragment.
I'm going in my car even though I can walk there, just because nobody's going out right now without calculating how long they've got to get to the nearest shelter and where could they go. So where I am now in central Israel, I would have about 90 seconds to get to a shelter. The people down south have as little as 5 seconds to get to a shelter, so they are staying literally in their apartments. So I'm here with my friend Marcel, and we're actually in their bomb shelter. They have a bomb shelter in their house as well. As you can see, the window is reinforced with like a steel door. This unfortunately didn't help an Israeli family the other day. A father and a son were in their bomb shelter, and some shrapnel managed to come through the steel door and the glass into the shelter. Marcel, how have things been like for you over the last few days?
We are extremely concerned about the situation in the country. Running to the bomb shelter is very scary, and you hear that siren wailing, and then you know that you have a very short amount of time to run to the bomb shelter. I think a lot about the Israelis that are living down south in the Ashkelon area, Ashdod, that are living along the Gaza Strip, and what that must be like, because they've been living with this their entire lives. And it must really be terrifying and very traumatic.
The new escalation broke out in the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah in May 2021. Many Palestinians were forced by Israeli authorities to leave their houses in the district and expelled without any justification. Many people filmed the violence in the town, publishing it on social media platforms, such as the following video. The violence has spread throughout the Palestinian territories up to the Gaza Strip, striking buildings and killing civilians. Among the targeted edifices there were the Associated Press and Al Jazeera media offices located in the Palestinian territories. From the outbreak of the violence until the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, at least 256 Palestinians were killed, of whom 128 were considered civilians. According to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, OHCHR, around 245 were killed by the Israeli security forces during the hostilities. Other 2,000 Palestinians were wounded, including 600 women and 400 children. Palestinians are suffering also of arbitrary detentions and unwarranted arrests made by Israeli authorities. An example of these episodes is the case of Mohammed and Muna el-Kurd. The two activists were arrested for their activities on social media, in which they denounced the illegal expropriations of territories made by Israeli security forces. Then, they were released. In fact, all these human rights violations are understandable in the light of the Israeli purpose to colonize Palestinian territories, replacing them with Israeli citizens. For this reason, Israel is accused by several parties of ethnic cleansing and apartheid. Mohammed el-Kurd has explained the illegal expulsions ordered by Israeli government in the following interview.
Hi Amy, good to be back. Yeah, I was standing in my neighborhood at night, and Israeli forces, while they were violently dispersing and suppressing the protesters and assaulting them and beating them, landed on me. And although they know that I live in the neighborhood, although they know my face, they forcibly took me out of the neighborhood. I would want to mention also that this has happened to me before in the same day in the morning, but there was no cameras to capture it. This is, I'm unsure if this was targeted or not, or if this is because of what I said on national television. What I do know is that Palestinians are targeted constantly by Israeli violence, be they outspoken or not. So for my Palestinian siblings, our silence will not protect us. We should all be speaking out against Israeli atrocities.
Where were they taking you? They were taking you out of your home. I mean, there's this other viral video of your twin sister who is telling a Jewish settler to leave your home. Where were these Israeli soldiers that we are showing now taking you?
They just threw me in the street and told me that I couldn't come back into the neighborhood. And they've done this many times to us. Many of my family members, many of my neighbors, they do this routinely.
And could you talk also, Mohammed, about the reports of a quite blatant collusion between settlers and Israeli security forces?
Thank God for social media, because not only in Sheikh Jarrah, in Haifa, in Led, in Yafa, in the Gaza Strip, we are seeing the Israeli settlers emboldened by the Israeli state. And there are many videos that have surfaced of Israeli police officers assaulting Palestinians and doing it with brute force and doing it with aggression, doing it like they have a personal vendetta against them, which they do. It's nothing short of terrorism. But again, like I said, it's thank God for social media, because it appears to me that the world is finally waking up to the fact that Israel is an apartheid state, and it treats Palestinians with such dehumanization. It treats Palestinians the way colonizers treat the colonized.
And also, as you point out, the role of social media, as a result, the whole world knows what's going on. And there have been protests held in many cities around the world. What is the significance of solidarity from activists and others in these different cities, including many in Europe, as well as some in the US?
Absolutely. I think those protests that are in hundreds of cities actually are also spearheaded by Palestinians in the diaspora, much like the protests that are happening all across historic Palestine. The first significance of these protests is that they've indicated to us that these colonial fragmentations that Israel has worked tirelessly, explicitly and implicitly to implement within Palestinians, these tactics of intimidation are not working. That we are all a Palestinian people, regardless of geography and regardless of legal status. We are all a Palestinian people, and we are rising up against this. I also think grassroots people on the ground all over the world are realizing that they have the tools to end Israeli aggression towards Palestinians, to end the Israeli occupation once and for all, to end Israeli settler colonialism in Palestine.
After 11 days of fighting, Hamas and Israel agreed to a ceasefire on the 20th of May. People from both sides showed relief as they celebrated on the streets. Both sides have also claimed victory. The ceasefire held, but no durable solution was reached to prevent future clashes. In fact, lasting peace once again seems to be more and more like a fairy tale. Indeed, it lasted less than a month, when the new Israeli government led by the leader of the Israeli right-wing party, Naftali Bennett, violated the ceasefire on 16th of June. So, a new wave of hard confrontations and clashes are starting again, jeopardizing the human rights of the parties involved. For this reason, it is important to raise awareness on the topic. The international community should take concrete actions in order to avoid another waste of blood and lives.